Okay, picture this. You're in a rainforest, right? It's like super humid. You can hear all these crazy birds, and you're trying to get seeds from a tree that's like taller than a skyscraper. How do you even start?
That is the daily life for seed hunters.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's not easy. It's a real challenge to climb those massive trees.
So today, we're going to learn how they do it. We're diving deep into this guide all about collecting seeds in tropical forests. It's like a manual, but instead of learning to lift weights, we're learning how to climb these crazy tall trees.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what these people do. They're so resourceful, you know?
Yeah.
Imagine trying to get seeds from a tree with a trunk so wide you can't even get your arms around it. Or what about those really old trees in protected areas? You can't even touch them, or you might hurt them.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's start basic. What do they use? Just like a regular ladder.
Well, for smaller trees, yeah, up to like 10 meters, they use ladders. Sometimes they're even made from bamboo.
Oh, cool. Like blending in with the forest?
Exactly. But when you get to those super tall trees, things get more interesting.
Yeah, it's got to be more than just a casual climb at that point.
Oh, for sure. That's when they bring out the big guns, like climbing spurs, for example.
Spurs, like cowboy spurs.
Not exactly. Think of them more like metal spikes that strap to your legs and dig into the bark. You need a lot of training to use them safely. One slip, and you could be in big trouble.
Yikes. Yeah, I can see how that would be dangerous. So do they use spurs on every kind of tree?
They work best on smaller trees with smooth bark. Once you start getting into the giants with wider trunks and branches everywhere, you need different tools.
This guide mentions something called a tree bicycle, which sounds kind of scary and cool at the same time.
The tree bicycle. Yeah, it's not a real bicycle, though. There's no handlebars or pedals or anything. It's basically two rings that grip the trunk.
Okay, so how does the climber actually move up the tree?
It's kind of like pedaling, but with your legs. You push and pull the reins to climb up.
Yeah.
It works really well on straight trunks.
That's so cool. It's like they're cycling up a tree. But I guess a tree bicycle wouldn't work on a tree with a lot of branches.
Nope. The branches would get in the way and make it impossible to keep a good grip. For those kinds of trees, they use some really clever techniques.
Okay, now we're talking. What do they do when a ladder or even a tree bicycle won't work?
So imagine a tree that's so big, it has huge growths at the bottom called buttresses. You can't even climb it directly. Or what about those super old protected trees? You can't touch the bark or you'll hurt them. So they can't climb those trees directly.
So how do they reach the seeds? How do they even get started?
Well, that's where the advanced line technique comes in. It's all about ropes and physics.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
Think of it like rock climbing meets fishing.
Rock climbing and fishing. What?
Okay, so first, they have to get a line over a strong branch, high up in the tree.
Right, I get the rock climbing part. But how does fishing fit in?
Well, to get that first line over the branch, they use all sorts of things. Sometimes they throw a weighted line. But for really tall trees, they need something more powerful.
Like a slingshot.
Closer. They actually use crossbows, or even air guns, to shoot the line way up high.
Whoa, seriously, they shoot a line into the tree.
Exactly. And then, once they have that first line secured, they use it to pull up heavier ropes, and sometimes even a lightweight ladder.
So they use the first line like a bridge to the canopy.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So they've got the ropes and the ladder, but how does the climber actually climb the rope? Is it all upper body strength?
You definitely need strength and stamina.
Yeah.
But it's more about technique. They use something called the prusik shuffle. It involves special knots that grip the rope. They basically inch their way up, sliding those knots upward and using their body weight for leverage.
The prusik shuffle sounds kind of graceful, like a dance move.
It can be, in the right hands, but it's tough work, for sure.
So we've gone from basic ladders to launching projectiles at trees. It seems like seed collecting is a pretty intense job. It takes a lot of skill and a little bit of bravery, too.
Definitely. And we haven't even talked about what happens once they actually reach the seeds. But before we get into that, let's think about the bigger picture. Why go through all this trouble? What's so important about collecting seeds?
That's a great question. We've talked about how they climb the trees, but why do they do it?
Why would someone choose to scale these giants with all the risks involved? Well, it's about a lot more than just collecting seeds. They're actually protecting something much bigger.
Protecting, what do you mean?
Well, think about how many different plants and animals live in tropical forests. They're home to something like half of all the species on Earth. And a lot of those species rely on these huge trees to survive.
So by collecting seeds, they're actually protecting the whole forest. It's like they're guardians of the ecosystem.
Exactly. Each seed is like a tiny package of information, a blueprint for the future. By collecting and protecting these seeds, we're making sure that all this diversity can be passed on to future generations.
It's amazing to think that something so small, like a seed, could be so important for the survival of an entire species.
It shows you that every part of the ecosystem matters, even the tiniest parts. But it's not just about conservation. These trees are also really important for people, economically and culturally.
Oh yeah, can see that. Like trees that give us wood, fruit, or even medicine.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the role they play in keeping the whole ecosystem healthy. They give us clean air and water, they prevent soil erosion, and they even help fight climate change. They're kind of like the unsung heroes of the planet.
So it's not just about individual trees, it's about protecting all the things those forests do for us. It's about taking care of both people and the planet.
Right. It's about seeing the whole picture.
Hmm.
And to do that, you need more than just climbing skills. You need to know about botany, ecology, even genetics.
Wow, so seed hunters need to be like super smart and skilled.
Right.
They're like scientists and athletes and nature lovers all rolled into one.
Exactly. But let's switch gears for a second. We've talked about how hard it is to reach the seeds and why it's so important. But what happens after they get the seeds down?
Yeah, good question. I guess they don't just throw them in a bag and call it a day. What happens next?
Well, it's kind of like a delicate dance between science and nature. The seeds have to be handled very carefully to make sure they stay alive. It's a very precise process.
So there's a whole other phase after the climbing that's just as important.
Absolutely. The seeds need to be cleaned and sorted and usually dried out to a certain point. Some seeds are really fragile and need special treatment to survive.
I bet it's different for each type of seed, right? Like a coconut would be a lot tougher than a tiny orchid seed.
You got it. Some seeds can handle a little rough housing, but others need to be treated with kid gloves. Some need to stay cool and moist, others need to be completely dry. It all depends on the species and what it needs.
So the researchers need to know a lot about seeds and how they grow. It's amazing how much science goes into something that seems as simple as collecting seeds.
It really is. It shows you how complex and amazing nature is. And speaking of amazing techniques, there's one that always blows my mind. They use smoke to help some seeds sprout.
Smoke? Seriously? I thought smoke was bad for plants.
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But some plants actually need smoke to germinate, especially the ones that live in places where there are a lot of fires. The chemicals in smoke tell the seed that it's a good time to start growing, usually after a fire has cleared out the area and made space for new plants.
Wow, that's so cool. So are they literally lighting fires to get these seeds to grow?
Not exactly. They figured out how to recreate the effects of smoke using things like smoke-infused water or special chambers. It's like they're mimicking nature in a controlled way.
It's like they're speaking the language of the forest, understanding all the little signals that make plants grow. This whole process is incredible, from climbing those crazy tall trees to carefully taking care of those tiny seeds.
It really is. And it shows you how dedicated these people are. They're working so hard to protect the biodiversity of our planet. But I think it's important to think about the other side of this, too. What happens if we lose this knowledge? What if we don't have people who know how to do this work?
That's a scary thought. We've been focusing on all the good things, the amazing things seed collectors do. But what happens if we forget how important this work is? What are we risking?
Well, one thing we risk losing is genetic diversity. Each seed carries unique genes, and if we lose those seeds, we lose the potential for plants to adapt and survive things like climate change, pests, and diseases.
It's like losing pieces of a puzzle, and that puzzle is the future of our forests. If we don't have all the pieces, the picture is incomplete and the ecosystem is weaker.
Exactly. And it's not just about the environment either. We could also lose access to valuable resources like wood, medicine, and the other things forests give us.
It's like cutting a vital lifeline, both for the environment and for people. This conversation has really made me realize how connected everything is. What happens to the forests affects all of us. We can't afford to ignore them.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's so important to support the people who are doing this work. The seed hunters, the researchers, the conservationists. They're the ones on the front lines, working to protect the biodiversity of our planet. They're the unsung heroes, making sure that these amazing trees will still be here for future generations.
Protecting a legacy, huh?
Mhm.
That's interesting. What does that even mean when we're talking about collecting seeds?
Well, you got to think about how diverse tropical forests are. Like, there are so many different plants and animals crammed into those places, right? It's estimated that like half of all the species on Earth live in tropical forests.
Yeah.
And a lot of them depend on those giant trees to, live.
So by collecting seeds, These climbers are like protecting entire ecosystems. It's like their job is to make sure the forest has a future.
Yeah, exactly. Every single seed is like this little time capsule full of genetic info. It's like a blueprint for the future, right? So by collecting these seeds and making sure they're safe, we're making sure that this incredible diversity can, keep going. It can be passed on to future generations.
It's kind of crazy to think that something so small, like a tiny seed, can have such a big impact. I mean, it could literally mean the survival or extinction of a species.
It really shows you that every part of the ecosystem matters, even the little things, right? But it's not just about conservation, though. A lot of these trees are important to people for other reasons, too, like economically and culturally.
Oh, yeah, of course, like
Yeah.
trees that we use for timber or fruit, or even the ones that have medicinal properties.
Exactly. And we can't forget the really important role they play in, keeping the whole ecosystem in balance. They give us clean air, clean water. They help prevent soil erosion. They even play a role in fighting climate change. They're like the silent guardians of the planet.
It sounds like it's not just about saving individual species, it's about protecting everything that forests do for us. It's about making sure both people and the planet are healthy.
Yeah, it's about looking at the big picture and how everything is connected. And to do that, you need a lot of different skills. It's not just about being a good climber. You also need to understand botany, ecology, and even genetics.
So seed hunters are kind of like the ultimate multitaskers. They need to be scientists and athletes and nature enthusiasts all at the same time.
Pretty much. But let's change gears a little bit. We've been talking about how tough it is to get those seeds and why it's so important. But what happens after they actually have the seeds? What's the next step?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not like they can just throw them in a bag and call it a day. What happens to the seeds after they're back on the ground?
Well, it's this delicate balance between, science and nature. You have to be really careful with the seeds so they don't die. It's a very precise process.
It sounds like there's a whole other side to this after the climbing that's just as important.
Oh, definitely. The seeds need to be cleaned and sorted and usually dried out to a very specific moisture level. Some seeds are super fragile and need special treatment to make sure they survive.
I bet the process is different for every type of seed, right? Like, I imagine a coconut is a lot tougher than, say, a tiny little orchid seed.
You're right. Some seeds can handle a little rough handling, but others are super delicate. Some need to stay cool and damp, others need to be bone dry. It all comes down to the species, what that specific seed needs to survive.
So it sounds like these researchers really have to be experts in seed biology. They need to know exactly what each type of seed needs to germinate and grow. It's pretty amazing how much science is involved in something that seems as simple as collecting seeds.
It is. It really shows you just how complex and amazing nature is. And speaking of amazing techniques, one of my favorites is that they actually use smoke to help some seeds germinate.
Wait, smoke? Really? I thought smoke was bad for plants.
I know, right? You'd think it would be. But some plants actually depend on smoke to know when it's time to sprout, especially the ones that have adapted to fire-prone environments. The chemicals in the smoke act like a signal to the seed, telling it that it's a good time to start growing, usually after a fire has cleared out the area and created some space for new life.
Wow, that's amazing. So do they like light fires to make these seeds sprout?
Well, not exactly. These days, they've figured out how to create the same effect as smoke using other methods, like smoke-infused water or special chambers that expose the seeds to smoke. It's like they're recreating what happens in nature, but in a more controlled way.
So they're basically communicating with the seeds using the language of the forest to help them grow? It's incredible. This whole process from climbing these massive trees to figuring out how to care for these tiny seeds is just mind-blowing.
It is. It really is. And it really shows you how dedicated these people are. They're so passionate about protecting the incredible diversity of our planet. But, it's important to think about the other side of this, too. What if we lose this knowledge? What happens if there's no one left who knows how to do this work?
That's a pretty scary thought. We've been focusing on the positive side of things, all the amazing things seed collectors do. But what are we risking if we forget how important their work is?
For one thing, we risk losing a lot of valuable genetic diversity. Every seed holds this unique combination of genes, and if those seeds are gone, we lose the ability for those plants to adapt and survive things like climate change, new pests, new diseases.
Yeah.
You know,
It's like we're losing pieces of a puzzle, and that puzzle is the future of our forests. Without all the pieces, the whole thing becomes weaker, more fragile.
exactly. And it's not just the environment that suffers either. We also lose out on all the things we get from forests, like timber, medicines, and all the other valuable resources they provide.
It's like we're cutting off a vital lifeline for both the environment and for people. This
Hmm.
conversation has really opened my eyes to how connected everything is. What happens to forests impacts all of us, and we can't afford to ignore that.
That's exactly right. And that's why it's so important to support the people who are doing this work. The seed hunters, the researchers, the conservationists. They're the ones out there on the front lines protecting the incredible biodiversity of our planet. They're the unsung heroes, working to make sure that these amazing trees are still here for generations to come.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that something as small as a seed can have such a huge impact, not just for one tree, but for the whole forest, and even for people.
It just goes to show how interconnected everything is, right? And it makes what those seed hunters do even more impressive.
For sure. We've talked about their climbing skills and their knowledge of plants and their passion for conservation. But I'm curious, what kind of person does it take to actually do this kind of work? What kind of qualities do they need?
Well, besides being physically strong and agile, they need a certain kind of, I don't know, personality, I guess. You definitely got to be okay with heights, that's for sure. And you need a good amount of courage, too, because things don't always go as planned when you're hanging hundreds of feet in the air.
Yeah, I bet. It must be pretty intense up there, dealing with the weather, the physical challenge of it
Oh,
all.
absolutely. But it goes beyond that, too. Seed hunters have to be good at solving problems, thinking on their feet, adapting to new situations. They're often working in really remote places, far from any help, so they got to be resourceful and able to rely on themselves.
So they're like part scientist, part athlete, part adventurer?
Yeah, you could say that, but there's also this artistic side to it. These people, they have this deep connection to nature, this sense of wonder and respect for the trees they're climbing.
It's like they're not just collecting seeds, they're collecting stories, knowledge, a deeper understanding of how everything's connected.
Exactly, and they're passing that knowledge on,
Hmm.
contributing to something much bigger than themselves, something that will last for generations.
It makes you think about all the people who have dedicated their lives to this work, right? From indigenous communities who have been collecting seeds for centuries to the scientists and conservationists today who are using all this cutting edge technology to preserve biodiversity.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're all part of this bigger story, this ongoing effort to understand and protect nature. And even small things we do, like planting a tree or supporting conservation groups, can make a difference.
Speaking of planting trees, this whole conversation has really changed the way I think about it. It's not just about putting a seed in the ground. It's like you're connecting with all those people who came before you, all those seed collectors and caretakers. You're participating in this cycle of renewal of life.
And it's about hope, right?
Yeah.
Every seed we plant is like this little act of faith in the future. It's believing that life will find a way, even when things are tough.
It's a beautiful way to look at it. It brings us back to that question you asked earlier. What kind of future are we risking if we lose this knowledge? If no one knows how to collect seeds anymore, what would our world be like without these giant trees?
It's a question we all need to think about, really. Imagine a world where the forests are shrinking, where the air isn't as clean, where there aren't as many different kinds of plants and animals. It's a world we don't want to live in.
It really highlights how important this work is and how much we rely on the people who do it. They're not just collecting seeds, they're protecting our future.
And they're inspiring us to look up, to appreciate the beauty and wonder of nature, and to do our part in keeping it safe.
Well said. I think we've given everyone listening a lot to think about today. We've covered a lot of ground, from the technical side of climbing these giant trees to the bigger picture of what it means for our planet and for the future. It's been a pretty amazing journey.
It has, for sure.
Uh,
And I hope it inspires our listeners to see trees in a new light, to really appreciate them.
yeah, to see those towering giants as more than just pretty things, but as these essential pieces of the web of life.
Because sometimes the smallest things have the biggest impact. And sometimes the most important journeys take us to the very top of the trees.